Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on a probably one of the hottest day in Cambridge, at least, or maybe even the hottest day in Cambridge. Thank you so much for taking the time to come, and thank you so much, Mohamed, for giving up your time to come and chat to us here at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Wow, you're clearly a celebrity. There is so many cameras out there. I'm usually get these many cameras out when I'm asking people to scan a QR code to Menti, but I'm just checking there is no Menti back there. So yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So what the plan for us today is, I'm going to fire off maybe 4, maybe 5 questions to Mohamed to get us started. And what I would like you to do in the meantime is to think about questions that you might want to ask him. And as usual, what we will be doing is we'll be rewarding those with the best questions. 3 best questions are going to get Mohamed's latest, I think it's the latest book, unless you've been busy. Yeah, so it's the latest book together with a bunch of colleagues, and we will get it signed. So, I mean, is that a great price or what? Yeah, fantastic. Cool. So let me just jump straight in and say, thanks again, Mohamed, and tell us a little bit about your journey. I mean, everybody know I'm not going to go read a bio. It's very extensive, hugely accomplished. But tell us a little bit about your journey to start off with, perhaps.
Okay, to start off, let me thank you and let me thank everybody for being here, especially on a Friday afternoon. Journey. Born in New York, moved around a lot as a kid, till I was 14. We're living in France. My father was moving again. I said, I can't do this anymore. He said, what do you want to do? I said, boarding school. Without knowing what I was saying, I ended up in boarding school in England, which in the 1970s was a character building exercise. Then I was lucky to get admission to Cambridge. And Cambridge was totally transformational for me. From Cambridge, I went on to Oxford to do a doctorate. Then I worked in the public sector at the IMF for 15 years. Then I decided to try the private sector. So I worked in an investment management firm for 15 years. And then I came back here. So that's my journey.
Is there something you haven't done? We will come to that. We'll come to that. You often say that Cambridge is a place you love, and it completely transformed your life. And I recently watched a video clip. So I don't know if you ever been to. I mean, I used to travel a lot, and every airport I arrived, they have the news on, right? And almost all airports that I went through, you could see Mohamed talking and giving commentary on the the state of the economy or whatever was on the agenda on the day. And he always does it from his home office. And what is interesting, one of the interesting things that I found out was when we are looking at you, you're looking at something else.
Yeah, I'm looking at a massive picture of Cambridge. And I do that because it inspires me. I had 2 experiences very early on when I came here. The first one was a very traumatic experience. In my days, you finished your A levels here, and then you stayed an extra term to do special Oxbridge exams. And you would turn up for an interview, and then you would follow up with the exams. And my economic teacher at school said, read this book. It's a bestseller. It was the beginning of the supply side revolution. Read it, and whatever happens, bring it up in the interview, because you're really going to impress the interviewers that you went beyond the school curriculum. So here I am in the interview. It lasts half an hour. We're 25 minutes in, and I haven't been able to bring the book in. And then I'm asked the following question. How do you price a ship going through the Panama Canal? That's the question that I was asked. And I said, that's a really good question. It reminds me of this book. Of course, I had nothing to do with the book whatsoever. And I had been interviewed by 2 people, one asking the questions, and then the other one, the junior one, taking notes. And we were in the rooms of the junior one. And the junior one suddenly smiles, puts his pencil down, and I should have realized I'm in trouble here, puts his pencil down and says, tell us about the book. And I went into this perfectly prepared monologue that I had practiced 100 times. And then he asked me a single question that destroyed the whole hypothesis of the book. And I couldn't answer the question. He got up, went to his shelf, pulled what's called an off-print at the time of a review of the book he had done in an economic journal.
Oh my gosh.
Flipped it to me and said, simply because it's in a book, it doesn't mean it's right. You've got to be much more critical. Came out almost in tears. Thank God we had the exams that I was able to recover on. And then I come up to this place where economics in my days was taught through the eyes of 4 different schools. You had the neoclassical school, you had the Keynesian school, you had the Ricardian school, and then you had the Marxist school. And we would learn through these 4 different perspectives. And it was really important because what I ended up here and why this was so transformational is because I realized education wasn't about what to think, but also how to think. And this is what Cambridge did for me. It's put that deep inside me in terms of how to think.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic story. I do a lot of interviews here for undergraduates, and what's funny is this exactly what happens. Many people write they've read the general theory, and then when you ask them about, oh, what's in the general theory, they're like, oh, they've read something, you know, on Wiki or something like that, and they go completely
So can I tell you my favorite interview story?
Yeah, please.
So this is the Nobel Prize winner, Demis Hassabis, who was here, and he came back to celebrate the Nobel Prize. And he was fished out of the pool at Queen's. You know, you go into a pool, he was fished out. And one of the questions he got asked, the answer was 31 factorial. 31 times 30 times 29, all the way down. And the interviewer asked him, what is that number? And Demis went quiet completely for about 4 minutes and then started giving numbers out. And the person wrote it down, times 10 to the power so-and-so. And it was very close to the right answer. And the interviewer said, all I was looking for you to say is it's a very large number. And the reason why Demis knew it, because you remember the HP scientific calculators. He used to play with his, and he could blow, you know, it stops calculating at 24 factorial. So he knew what 24 factorial was, and he simply wanted to find a way to go to 31 factorial.
Amazing. That's really amazing. Let me ask you something else, because another thing that many of you will be aware of is that in Cambridge and in the Cambridge Judge Business School, we have a institute which is called the El-Erian Institute for Behavioural and Economics Policy. Could you tell us a little bit about your thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, and this is now changing very quickly. There's lots of behavioral units being established. But when the original idea came up, there wasn't enough thinking about behavioral aspects when forming policy. So policymakers would design policy, they wouldn't get the reaction they expected, and they wouldn't get the outcomes they expected. And part of it is because there wasn't enough of a behavioral element into the policy design. So the idea was to create an institute where different disciplines would come in and help inform better policymaking. And the person who leads it right now, Professor Lucia Reich, is absolutely incredible. She collaborates across the board. It helps a lot on climate issues. It helps a lot on all sorts of aspects. And what's really important is to recognize that all of us have behavioral biases. We're born with the biases. And unless you understand what these behavioral biases are, you're not going to get the reaction you expect to get. And this is now very well documented, and we can talk about it in terms of why is it that successful companies fail. Often it's behavioral aspects that end up by bringing them down. So that was the idea, and under Lucia's leadership, it's been doing amazing things.
Brilliant. I encourage you all to go to the website, register on the mailing list, because it does really incredible workshops, but also speaker series and conferences. Let me now turn. Now we got some good stories. let me turn to the main question. It's about scaling startups. And I suppose the question that many of us are wondering is, how can we compete with the US? What are your thoughts?
So let me just say, let me start Cambridge and then go UK and then go Europe. Cambridge, the success rate from going from a seeding round to Series A is higher in Cambridge than it is in Silicon Valley. And then things go wrong. So there's this notion of an incubator economy where you create something, but then for it to grow and have impact, it has to go somewhere else, or it has to be acquired by somebody else. So the failure is that things start going wrong as you try to scale up. So what goes wrong? One is funding. There isn't as much institutional funding as there should be, given the amount of talent and given the amount of startups. And that's an institutional aspect. The other thing that happens is talent retention. In a world like this, if you don't grow quickly, your talent gets attracted from you. The third thing that happens is the ecosystem. The ecosystem is not growing fast enough in order to have the sort of cross-fertilization that is so powerful. And then the fourth thing is government. Economic uncertainty, a whole spaghetti bowl of regulation. Now, the good news is each one of these things is addressable. It just requires a lot of focus, and it requires putting innovation at the core of your growth strategy. And growth is what this country needs, what Europe needs. The bad news is that the more you lag now, the more you're going to lag in future. And you're starting to see it in a real way. So if you were to start at the beginning of the value-added chain, the US is very close, the UK is very close to the US and China. And then as you go further, the UK lags and gets closer to Europe. And that's not where you want to be right now. So, you know, it's addressable, and there is a lot of appreciation of what needs to be done. You just need consistent implementation.
So can I, a couple of weeks ago, I think you mentioned this example, which addresses the funding, the talent retention, the building of the ecosystem, and have the government support. And that was pretty much Demis, no? I don't know if I'm not sure many people know the story. I think that's a good case for how we can, retain, grow.
So if you want a really good book, Supremacy. Supremacy is the book of the two leaders in AI, Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis. Completely different cultures, completely different firms, but both of them doing really impactful stuff. Demis's story is a quite simple one. Absolute genius, chess protege. At the age of 12.
Queen's alumni.
Sorry?
Queen's alumni.
Right. At the age of 12, decides not to do chess anymore, finishes school at the age of 15, applies to Cambridge, gets interviewed, gets told he has a place, but he has to wait a year, works for a games company, making games, invents one of the most popular games at the time. The company at the age of 16 tries to retain him with £1 million payment. He decides, no, I want to go to university. He has this incredible intellectual curiosity, comes here, does amazing things, and then embarks on his lifetime quest of AGI, artificial general intelligence, and creates this firm, DeepMind. And you may have come across DeepMind in the game of Go when it beat the champion on that. And then the scaling issue hits him. So Google comes along and says, come to the US. And he absolutely, and that's what everybody would do. That's what everybody would do. He absolutely says, no, I'm going to stay here. There's talent here. And you're starting to see an ecosystem around King's Cross forming. There's talent here, but we need your funding. So he becomes part of Google, and Google gives him access to a tremendous amount of computing power, is what he needs. Then he has huge impact in industry after industry, and wins the Nobel Prize. But his decision was to bring Google to the UK. And that's something we discussed in the meeting, is that if you can't raise enough institutional funding, make the UK the second home for lots of very large companies here. It's not a perfect solution, but it is a better outcome. It's a second best compared to the fourth or fifth best we're in right now.
How you, I think, addressed all 4 points actually. Funding, talent, retention, building an ecosystem, and in this case also had government backing, of course. Can I turn to the second question? I think the big second question is, and you kind of mentioned it, is how do we grow? And if we don't grow, I mean, there's, I suppose the second question to the second question is, if we don't grow, there is also lots of inequality. And we also need to address climate change. We need to address inequality. We need to grow. Yeah. So what do you see as a solution? What do you think we should do?
So once a month, I have the following discussion with my daughters. I am really sorry. My generation blew it. We're leaving you with a world of low growth, high debt, high inequality, and a climate crisis. That's what we're leaving you with. We completely blew it. But at the same time, you have tools and innovations that were unthinkable just a few years ago. AI, life sciences, green technology, robotics, soon quantum. These are absolutely transformational tools that promise a significant increase in productivity. So you have high risks and high potential. And the question is, can you translate that potential to address the high risks? That's a fundamental question that we face as a society. And we tend to focus too much on the risks. So I'm going to say about the risks, but I also want to say about the potential. The fundamental problem to a lot of these things is that we don't grow enough, and the way we grow doesn't respect our planet. That's fundamentally the issue. So we need to grow better in a more sustainable manner, and we need to grow in a more inclusive manner. And it's possible. We have all the ability to do so, but we have to remove certain constraints. So look at this country. Today we got the monthly GDP number. It contracted by 0.1. This follows a contraction of 0.4. Every time GDP contracts, the fiscal situation gets worse. Every time, why? Because tax revenue doesn't grow. So the government then has three choices. One, cut spending. It tried to do that 2 weeks ago. It ended up in a total mess. Two, raise more taxes. This is already one of the most highly taxed countries. Three, borrow more. Already the bond market is getting impatient with the UK. So it increases the borrowing cost of the UK. The more you fail to grow, the more this vicious cycle pulls you down. And therefore, you really have got to focus on this innovation-driven growth strategy. It's a new style of industrial policy, not the old style of industrial policy, but the new style of industrial policy. Think of what has happened to AI in just 3 years. 3 years and 4 months ago, most of us heard for the first time about ChatGPT. And at that point, AI was about you ask a question, you get an answer. 2 years ago, AI became a task. It did tasks. Ask it to write you a letter. Ask it to write you a speech. Today, AI is becoming your intellectual companion. You interact all the time with AI. AI brings to the table an incredible knowledge of the things out there. And if you know how to interact with it, which is a big if, by the way, because things can go wrong, but if you know how to interact with it, you're in a completely different place than where you were before. Life sciences, I could tell you a similar story. Robotics, I can tell you a similar story. Green technology, I can tell you a similar story. Now imagine all these things coming together and what that enables. So this is a really exciting time for humanity, and it's a really critical time for humanity because the challenges are huge, but the opportunities are enormous.
And I suppose one last question, I'm going to open it up to you guys. So if you have questions in mind, make sure your hand goes up first because who you want to get to ask a question. If we think about, we know that there are opportunities. So what is the role of the private sector as opposed to government? What is it that we can do? So many of our colleagues here work in the private sector, executives. Yeah, what can we do, and what do we need the government to do for the private sector to respond?
So you need partnerships. I mean, there is this notion right now. You see it in the American market, in the American financial market, that the sovereign is not the corporate is not the sovereign. So if you look at what's happening in the U.S. financial markets today, the dollar is under pressure. There's concerns about debt. And yet there's concern about trade policy, and yet the stock market is at a record after record. And there's this notion somehow that the corporates, the private sector can flourish while the sovereign struggles. This notion that you can be a good house in a challenged neighborhood. I think that notion actually is really problematic. You can be a good house, but you also have responsibility for the neighborhood. And the neighborhood has responsibility for the houses. And you need dialogue and you need partnerships that go on. So, you know, what I tell people, you ask me here, is do the magic that you do, but also take responsibility for the neighborhood. And especially talking to the public sector, because the public sector tends to lag private sector activity. And unless there is a dialogue that's going on, then you're going to get bad outcomes from the sovereign. You're going to get bad regulation. You're going to get misconceived ideas, right? So there is a necessity not only to do the magic that you're able and that you will do, but also interact well with the sovereign to make sure that these partnerships do well.
Brilliant. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to stop because I can see some hands up. Maybe I'm lazy, so I'm going to start here. Here we go. Wait for the mic to come to you and then.
I want that book so badly that I actually had to write the question while you were talking. Mohamed, it's an area that I've had some experience in over the last 3 years, and it relates to emerging markets. So to what extent should governments in emerging markets take an active role in shaping startup ecosystems through incentives, infrastructure, or sovereign investment, or should they rely purely on market forces to drive scale and innovation?
That is such a good question, Alicia. No, the governments have to enable, incentivize, because it's a really rough environment otherwise if you don't do it. And what tends to happen is a brain drain. It leaves. It just leaves. You know, my family comes from Egypt. I can tell you the startup activity in Egypt is incredible. Absolutely incredible. But then when it comes to its impact on the economy, it's de minimis. And that's because they face obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. That means that they don't reach critical mass on there. So you really have got to have an alignment in emerging markets. I'm glad you bring them up because there's a real danger. We grew up in a world of convergence, whereby the industrial world would continue to grow, but the developing world would grow at a faster rate. Now we risk a world of fragmentation and reverse convergence, that people fall behind more and more. So it's absolutely critical for developing countries to take this issue really seriously.
Jump here. Oh. Stop putting your hands up. There are too many.
I work in the banking sector, and I'm also a member of the worshipful company of international bankers. So private sector and also the part of the London Corporation. If you could pick one policy, right, as you rightly mentioned, around this country, UK focuses a lot on boost the growth, and we need a strategy. If you could pick one regulation as the first one to pull, which one would you suggest to change, if we could prioritize that?
So the one, if you ask anybody that question, they'll tell you planning, okay? Being able to get things done. I won't go there. Okay, I think that's important. I think the one regulation I would facilitate the ability of institutional finance to fund startups. The UK, like other countries, got so shaken by the global financial crisis that it de-risked the financial system in a major way. And the result of de-risking the financial system in such a major way is that risky activities, by definition, don't get funded. But the system becomes so risk averse that a lot of successful activities end up migrating at a really early stage, and the country doesn't benefit from that. So I would look at what institutionally right now hinders risk finance. And you can do it without undermining the system. It gets done elsewhere. If you haven't all read it, the Draghi report, which was written for the European Union, is a really powerful report. And Jamie Dimon had quite a stunning statistic yesterday. He was in Ireland giving a speech. And he basically said, Europe, you're being left behind. You were 90% of US GDP 15 years ago. You are 60% of US GDP today. Think about that. 90 to 60. And the answer for that is in the Draghi report. Productivity is very low. Innovation is very low. In the case of Europe, risk finance goes to the US instead of funding in Europe. So the good news is there's a lot of awareness of all this because people understand the importance of productivity and growth. You just need political leadership to implement it.
First, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'm Peng from mainland China, so I'm going to ask some questions related to China. I do believe now US put China as the #1 competitor. For years, people saying China are going to take over US and the biggest economy. Do you think, given the new scenario now, like the trade restrictions and everything, do you think this is still the case, that China will take over US as the biggest economy?
The major headwind to China today is not the US, it's China. Okay, China has a growth model. And here, one of the collaborators on this book is Michael Spence, a Nobel Prize winner. He's done a lot of work on growth. So what I'm about to say comes from him. China's growth model was the Asian tiger growth model. Use the rest of the world to accelerate your own development dynamics. And it works extremely well till you become too big. When you become too big, you have to evolve your strategy from being externally oriented to being internally oriented. Go away from state-owned enterprises to private. Otherwise, you get stuck in what's called the middle income trap. you never make it to advanced country status because you're not changing your economy consistent with the size that your economy has become. And what has happened in China in the last few years is a very unusual muddled middle. China normally has this incredible strategy. It knows where it wants to be in 20 years' time. There's commitment to the goal. It understands that you cannot identify every single step. Identify the first few steps and then learn. Learn from your experience, learn from other people's experience. That is the mindset that resulted in one of the biggest development miracles. Over the last few years, what people have noticed is that China doesn't learn. It gets stuck. And right now, it's stuck between two things. The immediate urgency of stimulating the economy, because growth is slowing down. But that means stimulating an exhausted growth model. And if it does that, not only will it have the internal inefficiencies it's trying to deal with, but it will start dumping its exports on countries that will have a reaction to that. That's model number one, get immediate growth. Model number two is recognize that you have to sacrifice some growth in the short term because you are changing the way your economy functions, but accelerate that process of reform. And what we've seen is China do a bit of this, but never get out of the muddled middle. So to answer your question, yes, the US trade relations are certainly headwinds, but the major headwind is internal, is that policy formulation in China has got to decide which way it's going to go. And I think for the longer term, there's only one way, which is you have to reform the economy to be more domestically driven.
Mohamed, thank you so much for your comments. Truly honored to hear you speak, and thanks for your service to my company. I work at Microsoft Research. I have a question about AI, and it really just intersects with China. So it's really a great time to be alive. There's so much transformative impact about AI and the role it has to play across the spectrum of impact, robotics, life sciences, biotech, et cetera. I was wondering what you thought about China. Like the US has tremendous capital and VC flow, and China has remarkable scientific pedigree. Is there an opportunity to partner, or is it a winner takes all?
You know you're in trouble when someone from Microsoft asks you a question about technology, right? This is like warning signs everywhere. Look, this is where geopolitics comes in. In a perfect world, you cooperate. Okay, but we are not living unfortunately, in this world of cooperation. The geopolitics between China and the US are complicated. And there is a fundamental problem in how they see each other. The US sees China as the second, soon to be first, if it continues at 5 to 6% growth, economy in the world, and believes that China has to abide by certain global standards and global responsibility. China is number 55 in terms of per capita income. So it's not a rich country, it's just a very big country. And when you're number 55 in terms of per capita income, your mindset is my responsibility are still towards my citizens rather than to the global responsibilities. And it's that different. And India is going to be in the same situation in a few years' time on that. We haven't had countries go from middle income to advanced with that size. The other ones that did it, the Koreas, the Singapores, the Taiwan, they did it at much smaller scale. So this is a fundamental issue. So I think cooperation is going to be really hard in the years ahead. But if you lived in a perfect world, you'd absolutely have cooperation going on.
Thank you. I'm a lawyer, I work in the tech space, and I also work with startups. Like leaning into my colleague's point around banking, over-regulation at EU level and even at UK level. But I'm a bit torn because if we look at regulation from an EU perspective and even from a UK perspective, and we think about what we were speaking about earlier in terms of a better future, a better world for everyone, how do we marry the over-regulation, if you like, at EU level in terms of financial reporting, which is making it really challenging for EU startups and UK startups to compete with China and the US, with some of the good legislation that comes out at EU level around equality and inclusion. I very much believe in my values around collaboration, building ecosystem, leaning in. You mentioned Egypt equally. So how do we marry that? Because I feel torn. On one hand, EU is great at developing legislation around equality. On the other hand, we suffer startups as being able to meet regulatory requirements. I was at Google, and like 10 years in, we were getting compliant in a way. Nowadays, day one, as a startup, you need to be compliant with so many legislations. What's your view there?
Let me answer it by really simplifying it. Most innovations have good and bad in them. And let's call it the 70-30 problem, 70% good, 30% bad. Then culture comes in. If you present 70-30 to the US, they focus on the 70 and they forget about the 30. And if you look at how Google evolved, how Facebook evolved, they were changing the world. They didn't realize that they were going to have systemic importance. And they woke up to election manipulation, everything else, because they were so focused on the 70. And that's part of the US. You focus on the upside. Europe, you offer the same 70-30, and I'm simplifying here to make a point, they'll obsess with the 30 and regulate the 30 out of existence and sacrifice the 70 in the process. And I often think of the UK as some place that can have that balance between the 70 and the 30. And that's what's critically needed right now, is that balance. And hopefully you can help and others can help. But part of it is the regulators don't quite understand the 70. And the 70 don't quite explain to the regulators, okay, how they can also contain the inevitable. Every innovation has issues, because what's an innovation? It reduces the barrier to entry. And we as humans, the minute a barrier to entry is reduced, we overconsume and we overproduce, because that's what we do. So if you look at every innovation, something has gone wrong in the initial stages. And then the question is, do you catch up with the standards, with the regulations, et cetera? And AI is exactly the same challenge right now.
I have a question, Mohamed, back on economic growth. So economic growth suggests and perhaps demands continued growing consumption of resources, forest, water, ore, and at the same time, there's arguments to be made that the planet's reaching its ability to continue to deliver those resources. So how can we think about economic growth in such a setting? And is there an argument to be made now? Should we start thinking now about slow growth, no growth, degrowth? So I'd just like to hear your views on that.
Degrowth is not enough. I know you don't listen. You don't listen. Yeah. Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. We grew without respecting our planet. We did not think of what we were doing to our planet. So the way we grew was problematic. And we've gotten to that realization late. So I'm with you. I'm not in the degrowth camp also, because I believe you can grow in a better way, in a more sustainable manner. And I'm really excited about these innovations, because they're going to help us grow in a more sustainable manner. But these are tough decisions, because all of us here are going to have to decide to make sacrifices for future generations. And the political system has shown that we're not really good at making these sacrifices. So I think of this much more as a political problem than it is a sort of scientific problem. We can grow in a better way. We just have to get incentives aligned between generations.
Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. I'm one of your followers on LinkedIn. I admire all the posts that you share. One of your 2 million followers. So with the recent, so this is about the bit about geopolitics, foreign policy, especially around the US. So with the recent trends that we're seeing with the US dollar, and in the context of the recent sort of foreign policy and geopolitical situation, are you seeing the trends on the US dollar as a sort of short to medium term thing, or do you sort of see like a longer term trend around de-dollarization?
That's a great question. Let me first say there's two interpretations of what's going on in the US. Okay, and it's important to keep them both in and think of a range. Okay, so one end is the really optimistic view, and you'll hear this in the administration. This is Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher on steroids. We are reforming the domestic economy, and we are reforming the global economy. And just wait, we're going to come out of this with a more efficient economy, a smaller government. We're going to come out of this having unleashed more productivity, and we will trade in a fairer system. That is one view. The other view is that this is Jimmy Carter, that what's happening now is that you're robbing the US of its economic exceptionalism. Growth is slowing down. Inflation is stubborn. Debt is going up. You're fragmenting the global system. And if you're not careful, not only will you have stagflation, but you will have outright recession. And that really matters because the US, whatever happens in the US doesn't stay in the US. So this is the range of views. The market started the year, just to give you, betting 80% good. Then come April, Liberation Day, which surprised the market, that implied pricing of the good went down to 30%. Now the implied pricing of the good has gone up to 60%. So the views are all over the place right now. That's the US view. What does the rest of the world view? See this. The rest of the world has bought into a system where the US is at the core of the global system. It provides the reserve currency. It provides the biggest financial markets. Other countries outsource their savings to the US. The US has enormous privileges from having the reserve currency, from having other people's savings. It also has veto power in a lot of institutions. And against that, the world expects the US to manage the system responsibly. 2008, global financial crisis originates in the US. 2017, the first tariffs, US. 2022, the bad sharing of vaccine, US. 2025, tariffs, US. So the rest of the world is losing confidence in this. So what you're seeing happen is the rest of the world is trying to reduce its overweight to the US dollar. The problem is you cannot replace something with nothing. There is no other currency that can replace the dollar. So if you are right now holding lots of dollars, your only viable choice is to slowly diversify into many, many things. That's why gold has been doing so well. That's why Bitcoin has been doing so well. So what you do is you diversify in many, but you go slowly. I think that this is going to continue. I think that the world has realized it's overweight the dollar. And unless you believe in the Thatcher, Reagan on steroid outcome, if you believe that, then you can stay overweight the dollar. But if you don't believe that, then the world's going to try to continue to reduce its dependence on the dollar, but it's going to do it very slowly because there aren't all that many alternatives.
Diversify and go here.
Right.
Thank you so much. I have a question about the education system. And from two perspectives, first, what do you think is the role of universities in the current environment of rapid technological change? Do universities need to transform in any way, or are they still holding their position? And the other one is your view on the current education system in the UK amid financial difficulties that the institutions have to deal with. Thank you.
I feel very passionate about this. Okay, first, the first part of your question, it's already evolving. The way you do research is evolving. The way we learn is going to evolve even more quickly going forward, and universities have to absolutely evolve in this. You know, I'm old enough to remember something called the slide rule. How many people remember what a slide rule looks like? Okay, thank you. For the rest of you, a slide rule was the days before calculators. And it was a very cumbersome way of calculating things. I was at school when the calculator was invented. They wouldn't let us use it. That was complete denial. Somehow we had to maintain old technology. And finally, when we were allowed to use the calculator, it had to be the basic calculator, right? Because somehow it was going to take away our critical thinking and everything else. We cannot make this mistake now. Right? We have to embrace the better way of learning, the better way of research, understand it's not perfect, so the critical thinking is absolutely important. Humanities has a huge role to play in this, absolutely huge role to play in this. So we've got to adapt. Then comes the second question, which is that the higher education system in the UK is in trouble. And the model is very easy. Fees are capped at just below £10,000. At Cambridge, the average student costs about £15,000. So you have a business model that produces excellence, but the only way it breaks even is you shut it down. So you can't increase fees because already that is an issue. You can try to reduce expenditure, but you cannot have a vibrant anything if you go through round of austerity after round of austerity after round of austerity. So you've got to find alternative sources of revenues. And that's the challenge that the higher education system faces. Philanthropy is underdeveloped compared to the US, so there's huge potential there. There's also potential for other sources of revenues. You're one of them. Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So again, you know, there are answers, but these are things that require a lot of focus on this. One of the problems, I don't know if you, when I was at the IMF, they promoted you on the basis of technical expertise. So at the age of 31, I'm suddenly managing 200 people. And I've never managed anybody in my life. So the IMF was smart enough to allocate you a coach, a management coach. So the management coach would come every week, like a psychiatrist, sit and said, okay, what's your problem this week? And I remember telling him, my problem is that every time I try to do something, I get bombarded by 10 other things. And he said, what about the important and urgent matrix? And I said, what is the important and urgent matrix? And he said, imagine 4 boxes. One axis is importance, not important, important. The other axis is urgent, not urgent, urgent. The box that has important and urgent, most people know how to do that. The box that has not important and not urgent, most people know how to avoid it. The trouble is in the other 2 boxes. Most people fall into the trap of urgent but not important. And the sort of question you ask is in the important but not urgent. Right? So you tend to forget your business model is fundamentally going to have to reform, but you can wait a little bit, wait a little bit, wait a little bit, because you have all these other things that you have to do. And next thing you know, the problem becomes very difficult. So, it's this notion of use structure to do the heavy lifting, use structure to remind you of what's important but not urgent, because in a few years' time, it's going to be really urgent, and then you would have lost a lot of time. Same thing with growing in a sustainable manner. It was exactly the same thing.
Brilliant. And that was a fantastic question, because we have quite a lot of people online who are asking questions. And one of the questions was precisely that: how do we see, as president of Queen's College, how do you see this role of institutions evolving? So thank you, Sydney, online. I'm going to take two more questions online. And they're actually asking very similar questions. Patrick and Yasser are asking, what about going back to entrepreneurship and the startup and the scale-up culture? They're talking about the culture in some countries, the way we think about failure, in particular here versus the US, is very, very different. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I teach at Wharton, okay? And whenever I do lunchtime, and everybody immediately wants to talk careers. I don't care about everything else. I just want to talk careers. How they're going to have successful careers. And it's a completely different view of the world. The world I grew up in, there were career ladders. You selected a ladder: banking, doctor, engineer, and you climbed. And if you fell off that ladder, if you failed, it's the end of the world. So you become very risk averse. You don't want to fail. And this notion that you can change ladders was completely alien. The world we live in today is so enabled that it's like a jungle gym. You go up, you go across, you can do multidisciplinary stuff. And if you fail, if you fall off in the US, it's a learning experience. It's not a disaster, it's a learning experience. And that mindset that go out there, try something, if you fail, that's fine, you would have learned something, is a really powerful motivator. If you have a notion that if you fail, it's the end of the world, then you're not going to take risks. And no, so the culture issue is really, really important. The important thing is to have safety nets. You fail, but you...
Are you trying to submit your question online?
and that...
It's quicker. I'm going to be taking questions from the floor. Don't put it in. It's okay.
But I tell you, the most important distinction in business is between a recoverable mistake and a non-recoverable mistakes. Most mistakes are recoverable. Quite a few are not recoverable. And understanding where that line is really, really important.
Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is, I know time is running out. So are you okay with us overrunning a few minutes or no? Yes? Okay, what I'm going to do is maybe I take 3 questions and I bundle. Is that okay with you, Mohamed? Yeah. So, thank you. Thank you very much, sir. So go here. Quick questions, no drama. Boom.
Yeah, my question is, obviously, we live in a world that's very money-driven and capital-based. How do we change the incentive structure of success?
Say it again.
So I'm from Silicon Valley and I live there, and everything that a lot of people are building right are very capital-driven. How do I make the most money, the most investment, everything like that? And I'm curious, I think a lot about this. How do we change the incentives of success?
You want to have a quick one? I think, no, you can. Tricky one. Maybe we can, when you get 3, you can avoid 2, maybe. Go on, you do.
Are you sure? Okay. So I've worked with a few Series A plus startups in the UK and several based in the US. And something I've observed in that pool is that the sort of mentality around innovation ambition and the pace at which it's done is a lot slower here in the UK. So there seems to be this mentality thing. At the same time, I'm doing work, as many of us are. We're finishing up our research projects with the GEMBA program. And I've been talking to directors of startup scale-ups as part of that. And something that they've been saying is, at our companies, which are startups, we're experimenting with using AI, generative AI, to make the business more efficient. But really, it's all just a lot of individual companies experimenting. And for companies that are typically so strapped for resources, that are maybe don't have the funding levels that their US counterparts or competitors might have. I'm wondering if you think there could be a solution in some kind of organization or educational play or something that could actually help startups really understand how they can leverage AI to overcome some of those funding gaps.
You know, it's too late for your IP to put this in. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Thank you. With global interest rates being what they are, how should capital scarce countries think about funding their long-term innovation versus their short-term economic stability?
Those three, is that okay, Mohammed? And I take another cluster here. Yeah.
They always tell you that, oh, there's 4 now. Okay.
No, you go. You wait for the next
Oh.
round. Yeah.
God, these questions are getting really, really hard. Okay, on the first one, on the culture issue, on the incentive issue, please read Supremacy, because it compares OpenAI to DeepMind, and it compares the 2 cultures and the 2 incentive systems. Okay, and it's a fascinating read. I think ultimately it's the issue of what culture does a leader want his firm to look like, to have. Honestly, I don't have an answer. I wish I had an answer. I don't. On AI, and there's a lot right now that's available. That's not that capital intensive. The diffusion of AI is going to happen not in a sort of top-down dictated manner. It's going to happen through people experimenting, people getting comfortable, people making sure that they have the precondition. When AI first started, I was invited, this is 2 Christmases ago, to a dinner where they had the major retailers of the UK. And they had an AI company, an AI consultant present what AI could do for them. And this is the range of reaction. One person says, we're way ahead of you. We're already using AI to optimize supply chains, to optimize inventory. We've started using AI to try and understand our customers better. And at the other end was, we have 100 stores. The data from different stores don't talk to each other. So this notion that I can have an AI agent and an AI overlay on it, it's just absurd, right? So diffusion is going to be far from even because initial conditions are far from even. But startups are the best ones because they don't have legacy issues, right? It's the legacy issue that get you into trouble. The funding question, what a great question. What a great question. I'm a great believer that if you look globally, there isn't a lack of capital. The capital is there. There are market failures that stop the capital getting to where it should be. I'll give you a very simple example today in Mexico. If Pemex, the oil company, wants to go and borrow from abroad, it issues a bond, and it pays somewhere along 6.5% to 7%. If Pemex suppliers, the ones who supply Pemex, who have Pemex receivables as collateral, want to go out and borrow, they are too small to borrow from the capital markets. So they arrange private credit. So you as a private creditor go to a Pemex supplier and you get a Pemex receivable, so you get Pemex risk. Then you get uncorrelated collateral. You can get something from the company's collateral. And that company pays you 17%, 10% more. Why? There's information failures, there's institutional failures, there's things like that. So this is like the housing market in the US and the UK 40 years ago, 50 years ago. These things will improve because people will realize these are the same risks. They're just operating in different environments. So yeah, there's a lot of problems right now. But again, these things, once you understand where either the market failure is or the institutional failure, they can get fixed.
Hi, Mohammed. I think You know, I'm in the same generation as you and damn guilty of how we've treated our generation for the next. And there's so much untapped human capital in the world. You know this, particularly in low income and low middle income countries that are more stressed because of climate change and the effects of agriculture and ultimately social mobility. I mean, people want self-worth and they want the dignity of providing healthcare, education, and having that ability to move up in the world. So if we create startup models that help using all the innovative techniques of green tech, fintech, agri-tech, using the models of micro equity and microfinancing, again, it gets back to money. What is your experience with public, private, philanthropic NGO combinations to help drive and fund? Because you can't do it by just one. You can't do it with the PP because of the regulatory issues.
By the way, just so you know how popular you are, most of these guys have a dinner at 7, and they're still here. I'm very impressed. So quick, screw dinner. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna do these 3, and then maybe we'll see. I think probably Ross.
So the US dominates startup scaling largely due to deep capital markets, an aggressive risk culture, and a tolerance for failure. But many emerging markets can't or shouldn't replicate this model. So here's my question. Should developing countries stop chasing Silicon Valley and instead design an entirely different scaling model? One rooted in patient capital, state-backed incubation, and strategic protectionism? Or is it just that it's a romantic fantasy that just risks permanent economic irrelevance?
Thank you. First, I'm the American. Second, not only that, I'm the one live in Bay Area, California. So this is my question. Why does the UK want to compete with the US in scaling startup? How about we think a different way to create an ally, a joint venture between two parts? Let the UK do the something good and let the US do something they are very good about. How about like that?
Oh, okay. I'm gonna quick.
This works really well because mine's very similar to the previous two. I was going to say the same thing about the UK. I think chasing a competitor is a bad strategy in general. Do you think the UK, similar to these two, is too focused on chasing the US and not focused enough on differentiating itself in the global market?
Thank you so much for that. Those 3 are one question, so I can take one more question. That's fantastic. Last one.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up on your answer to Daniel's question before. And I appreciate that. I hear you on the degrowth. But I mean, we haven't really decoupled growth from material use and kind of eating up the planet. And I was really curious about what you said about aligning incentives across generations. And I would love to hear a little bit more about how you think about that.
Wow. Okay, so first, let me start with the developing country, then go to the UK, US, and then end up with aligning incentives across generation. The old model was labor goes to capital. Then it became capital goes to labor. Now, labor cannot move from developing countries to industrial countries to migration concerns. Capital is getting sucked up in industrial countries because the old model of manufacturing is no longer as dominant as before. So you don't go looking for cheap workers, etc. So unless the emerging developing countries evolve their own model, they're going to just be left behind. That's just the reality of the situation. And that implies doing leapfrogging stages that they have to leapfrog. And you're able to do that. Now, there was a question about, well, don't you need your own different things until the strategic protectionism is the thing that I stumbled on. Who said strategic protectionism? Someone here. Yeah. This is, what is strategic protectionism? Okay.
So it would be basically like safeguarding the areas. I'm not going to be as good at explaining as you, though.
But you have to know what it is, why you're safeguarding stuff, okay? Are you safeguarding stuff so that people make profits?
So people make profits. So basically the people who are at the lower.
Right, but are they staying inefficient? I come from a country where this has resulted in massive inefficiency. And
because it is, they're highly underpaid as well, but they're also highly inefficient as well.
Right, well, so we should have a discussion on this. No, look, US, UK, I'm all for the UK finding itself. That's why I went to the 70-30 example. The question is, how will the UK get there? Right now, there is no vision to get there. There's simply no vision to get there. Right? So if you have no vision, you're gonna try and chase an existing model. We could have a whole class on this, as to where do you position the UK.
Yes, please.
I mean,
not tonight. Not tonight.
If right now, if you were to present someone with all the initial conditions of the UK, they would predict that the UK would have a much higher per capita income than what it does today. Okay, so this is not about initial conditions. This is about translating initial conditions into outcomes.
Brilliant. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop there. Those of you who need to, first of all, huge thanks, Mohamed, that was amazing. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Second of all, sincere apologies. I know there are more questions from the floor, and there's now a lot more questions online. So apologies for those of you online that we didn't get to answer your questions. Huge thanks. What we're going to do is the people who want the books can have to sacrifice dinner to have their book signed if they're going for dinner. So I'm going to do for the first person to ask questions, because that's quite brave. That was very good. I'm also going to do for the person who set off a trend, because I then heard loads of other people trying to join the Zoom webinar to ask you questions. So that's for you. And the third one is obviously education is key for economic growth. So that's the trend. Amazing. Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. And what we're going to do as a tradition is, if you need to get going, go going. Otherwise, we're going to do a selfie. There are loads of us here. So if you want to stay for the selfie, stay where you are, and then we're going to group everybody together and take one. Is that okay, Mohamed? Okay, cool. Thank you very much again.